Welcome to another episode of Built in the Borderland. I am your host, Robert Holguin. This week, we are focused on the border, specifically immigration, the border wall, and the Trump administration's policies when it comes to the southwestern border. This week, I spoke to the Acting Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection, Mark Morgan.
I get so frustrated, the vitriol and the tax on the men and women, CBP and ICE, for doing our statutory responsibility.
The Trump administration taking something of a victory lap right now when it comes to how many miles of border wall they've been able to build over the past several years.
Right now, we've exceeded 2 miles per day and more than 10 miles per week.
Morgan will break down some of those numbers, and we will talk specifics when it comes to some of the controversial policies that have been put in place when it comes to asylum seekers and when it comes to immigration in general. I will also be speaking to Democratic Congresswoman Veronica Escobar. The El Paso lawmaker says there is nothing to celebrate about what the Trump administration has done along our border.
Even from a fiscal perspective, it is, as I mentioned, egregious waste.
Also, in the next 30 minutes, I talked to Acting Secretary of Homeland Security, Chad Wolf, about the specifics of the policies at our border that some say are illegal.
When we're in a public health emergency, and we're still in a public health emergency, that trumps most things that we talk about.
We're also going to be talking to author D.W. Gibson. He just wrote a book about the border wall. It focuses on Southern California, but it talks about the border wall's impact on the entire southern border. We're also going to get an update on the status of this privately built border wall in Sunland Park, now that the founders of the organization that built this wall are facing federal charges. And finally, we'll meet photographer John Kirk. He is something of an activist who is protesting the construction of the border wall through photography. So, definitely a lively discussion ahead. I hope you can stick around for it on this week's episode of Built in the Borderland. Immigration, in particular illegal immigration, was a huge topic in 2016 when it came to the presidential race. Not so much this time around.
We're still not out of the woods yet. Now, make no mistake, this president's administration has given us tools and a network of initiatives that we've never had before that's been instrumental in us addressing the crisis. Make no mistake.
One of the tools that Morgan is talking about is, of course, the border wall system. Despite the pandemic, construction has continued at a breakneck pace. Morgan says the Trump administration has built 380 miles of border barrier. More than 100 miles are in the El Paso sector, and the goal is to have 450 miles completed by the end of the year. In El Paso's lower valley, crews are currently replacing the 18-foot fence that ran alongside the border highway. Now a 30-foot bollard wall stands in its place.
And I think this is important. The Army Corps of Engineers, as well as the CBP's wall team, even during the middle of a global pandemic, we've actually sped up the construction of the wall system. We're actually building more miles per week than we ever have before.
Congresswoman Veronica Escobar, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Robert. My pleasure.
So, Congresswoman, yesterday I spoke to Commissioner Mark Morgan. He tells me that they are currently building 10 miles of border wall per week. The Trump administration claiming victory on this, saying that the president has kept a campaign promise. Your response to that?
Well, I think it's really important for folks to understand that much of it is replacement, taking down old infrastructure and putting new infrastructure. And that's part of their declaration of victory. The fact of the matter, though, is that they are definitely spending hundreds of millions of dollars on these replacement wall pieces or fence pieces, whatever you want to call them. In some cases, and I consider this really egregious government waste. In some cases, it's replacing like a 15 foot high wall with an 18 or 20 foot high wall. I have asked repeatedly what's the science or the data behind needing to go a few feet higher. These are massive pieces of steel fencing. They're not cheap. And so, just even from a fiscal perspective, it is, as I mentioned, egregious waste.
In this case, why the upgrade along this particular stretch where there seemed to be a formidable fence at least?
So I'm glad you're asking that question. That's why I'm going to continue to stick to every mile of wall system that's built, all 300 miles, is a brand new mile of wall. And here's why I'm going to stick to that. Even though there was this fence that you called to, I wouldn't say it was formidable. I mean, we can look right now, I think it's just right down there where you see what they've just torn down. It was this mesh, and actually they could come in and cut through it fairly quickly. Within under a minute, they could cut through and just come right through.
Apprehensions at the southern border are down dramatically this year compared to last. That's due largely to another so-called tool, the Trump administration's Remain in Mexico policy, otherwise known as migrant protection protocols. It requires asylum seekers to remain in Mexico while their asylum claims are processed in the court system here.
If you remove MPP, which is really what ended catch and release, we're going to be back to catch and release. And that was one of the biggest pull factors. They knew once they made it to American soil, they were going to be released in the United States, never to be heard from again. And then on top of that, we have sanctuary cities that are protecting those that entered the country illegally. And now it's even more than that. Sanctuary cities are not just protecting folks that are here illegally, but now they're actually giving them rewards. They're talking about making sure that they have jobs that they're illegally not allowed to have. They're talking about giving them driver's license, free health care.
The Remain in Mexico policy has effectively shut down the asylum process. You and others have argued that has illegally killed the asylum process in this country.
That's right. There are, what we have heard from advocates and from lawyers about the incredible and stunning lack of due process. Literally, folks are being processed, quote unquote, within about 90 minutes. And what we have seen time after time, month after month from the administration is they will use any situation, any excuse to erode asylum laws and to essentially create a different kind of country and a different set of laws than what America has known for years and years.
Also, when the pandemic hit, the Trump administration took sweeping steps to scale back immigration, including emergency policies that allow border agents to rapidly deport migrants arrested at the border.
So folks are being processed within 90 minutes, aren't being given due process, really creating greater health risks, because what we're hearing is, number one, not only are the migrants who are surrendering themselves to Border Patrol being rapidly sent back, but the American government has created a new avenue for cartels to exploit these vulnerable populations. And all that is happening is that these vulnerable populations are then being driven to another point along the border. And so we're just forcing more and more contact among people, including Border Patrol agents, during a global pandemic.
I dismiss that criticism. What we saw from the early days is DHS received an order from the CDC director. CDC had been down here along the border in 2019 to look at our facilities. They're very much aware of our facilities, and they said, individuals coming across that border illegally that have no travel papers, that have no medical history, you don't even know who they are in some cases. Your facilities are not built to bring these individuals in and care for them in a COVID-like environment. And that's for really two reasons. One is to protect the men and women of the Border Patrol, right? So if you go back to last year when we had over 100,000 folks crossing that border illegally and we were releasing into the country, you can imagine bringing those individuals into small, cramped Border Patrol facilities, what that does in a COVID environment and what type of outbreak that we could possibly have. So one, it's there to protect our workforce, but two, it's there to protect the American people that live along the southwest border.
Children are brought here by coyotes and lots of bad people, cartels, and they're brought here and they used to use them to get into our country. We now have as strong a border as we've ever had.
It's not coyotes didn't bring them over, their parents were with them. They got separated from their parents. And it makes us a laughing stock and violates every notion of who we are as a nation.
If elected, Joe Biden has said he would undo Trump's policies at the border and, quote, reassert America's commitment to asylum seekers and refugees. Morgan says that will result in more economic refugees coming to the country illegally.
I can say that as the acting commissioner of CBP, that's an apolitical statement. It's fact. If you take away the tools right now that have been the reason why we're able to catch and release, and you take away tools like the wall system that has absolutely increased the Border Patrol's operational capacity to counter and interdict those illegally entering the United States. If you take those tools away, Robert, it's common sense. Of course the flow is going to increase.
Coming up after the break, what does the wall symbolize? I talked to author D.W. Gibson about his newest book, coming up.
Hey everyone, so I am now joined by author D.W. Gibson. He recently wrote this book here, 14 Miles, Building the Border Wall. It was published earlier this summer. D.W., thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it, Robert.
So in your book here, you focused on 14 miles of Southern California, but you cover what the border wall means in terms of how it is changing the landscape of this country. But your book argues that it's changing the country literally, as a large fence on the border, but also figuratively and also symbolically. Can we talk about that a little bit? Expand on that for me.
The idea of a wall, if you spend just a little bit of time looking at it, talking to someone who discovers tunnels under the wall, talk about people who have scaled the wall already, looked at video of the wall falling down in stiff winds, you can really quickly surmise that it's not that effective as a singular tool. Even when you talk to Border Patrol agents, they talk about it in the context of a suite of tools, right? More surveillance tools, better technologies, more agents perhaps, more training, all kinds of things. So not just the wall. But I think the thing that's so satisfying for so many Americans when they think about the wall, particularly those that might be concerned about immigration, the shape of the country, is that it plays into the mythology that we hold so tightly to. This idea, and I talk about it in the book, this idea of the white picket fence. I really think it's just a national version of that, right? And think about how important the white picket fence is to our identity as Americans, right? That's how we sort of identify the notion of a dream, right? My property, my space that I'm responsible for, and this is where I need to keep myself safe and measure my responsibilities. And I think that's what the wall does for the country on a national level, right? We mark that space, we mark our territory, which is very important, the idea of private property and marking it, but also gives us a space where we can say, okay, this is where our responsibility ends. Anything beyond this line doesn't apply to us. And I think that that's misguided. I mean, we might want that. We might want to be able to limit our responsibility. It can be stressful in the modern world. But the fact is we are, for better and for worse, living in a globalized world. And there's no way that a barrier can define what our responsibility and our relationship is to the rest of the world. And you're right. That's why it does get a lot of play, because it is so easy to see and understand and wrap your head around, at least in terms of the physical thing that it is, but then also all these ideas that we attach to it, which again are erroneous, and I think sort of end up harming Americans and our relationship with the rest of the world.
Commissioner Morgan, what would you say to those who talk not of the wall as an enforcement tool, but as a symbol?
My response is, I'm not into symbolism. I'm into doing what we need to do and give the men and women of CBP the tools and initiatives they do to protect this country and do it so safely. That's my job, not symbolism. I'll let some other people talk about that.
This isn't going to address the root causes of migration. It never has, and it never will. And until we address those root causes, building walls or putting up infrastructure may make the president's base happy, and it may fire them up and get them excited, and they, it becomes a symbol of something else. But it doesn't address the problems that we need to address. And that's why in the House, the House of Representatives has been so adamant about refusing even a penny more for this exercise. So what has the president done instead? He's stolen from the military, from our infrastructure, from our military families in order to accomplish this task.
I get so frustrated, the vitriol and the tax on the men and women of CBP and ICE for doing our statutory responsibility. Right now, the law says it's illegal for you to come in between the ports of entry. It's illegal, and that's a crime. And guess who passed that? Congress. If you don't like the laws, why are you coming after CBP and ICE that's doing their job to enforce it? You don't like the laws, you should be picketing Congress. You should be saying it at their house.
This has been going on for years, right? This is where President Trump started his first campaign 4 or 5 years ago, right? So what we've done politically with the idea of a wall has been so destructive. And I think that unfortunately, a lot of the leadership that's in place right now is made up of individuals who are willing to go along with that myth, that are willing to go along with that storyline. And I really don't like to sort of paint things in such broad a stroke, but that's just the dynamic that we're in right now.
Coming up after the break, a photographer activist documenting the construction of a border wall that he calls the destruction of the environment. Hey everyone, so I am now speaking to John Kirk. He is a professional photographer, a concert photographer by trade, but is now working to document what's happening in the Arizona wilderness when it comes to the construction of the border wall. So John, first of all, thanks for chatting with us via Zoom.
Thanks for having me, Robert. Anytime.
First of all, tell me where you are now. You're talking to me from where?
I am in Douglas, Arizona, in a Walmart parking lot.
Okay.
Because I'm limited with where I have internet access, especially when I'm out in the field. I've gotten a lot of like live blasting going off, so that actually when the dynamite goes off, I've got my drone, so that's pretty much what I'm doing right now, is capturing it's basically ground zero right now as far as the devastation going on.
John, can you describe to me what you're seeing when you're describing the blasting? And we're going to look at some of your video, some of the drone footage you've acquired, but give me a sense of what you're seeing in terms of what is essentially a remote stretch of desert wilderness that then is being transformed forever, I suppose, right?
Yeah, I've become a little bit immune to I'm not as shocked anymore because I kind of know what the process is. Today's blast was the entire day was set or spent by the crew to set up the holes. There was according to one of the reports that I get from let's say an independent source, there was approximately 300 holes drilled, and all that it was packed with dynamite. So today an entire ridge that's actually on that's where the border wall will go. And it's so interesting because where that 30-foot wall is going to go, the mountain above it is higher, so it's going to butt up to the rocks, and you literally, if you wanted to, you just walk right down the rock in Mexico and come right over. I'm not sure where that design came from, but they're only limited. They can only blast so much because right now they are inches from the Mexican borderline.
When seen from above, from this perspective, it's hard not to think of a wall through this terrain as folly. But Morgan says that's not the case.
I was just in Arizona last week, and I went over some terrain, and I said to the pilot and the Border Patrol leadership that was there in the helicopter with me, I'm like, well, wow, clearly people don't come across this terrain. And they all kind of collectively laughed and said, oh, yes, sir, yes, they do. So terrain that we see, that we think is impenetrable, that no way anyone would try, they do.
So you've spent weeks and you've been isolated, you've been alone, you've been out there doing this. For what? What are your purposes? You're raising awareness.
Yeah, I want to shed some light on what's going on, the ecological, the biological disasters. And I'm going to keep, I'm going to stay here. My goal now is to document it until, or if it ever stops. And then to see some of it taken down that was put up illegally.
Remember this privately built border wall in Sunland Park, New Mexico? This half-mile stretch was funded through an organization called We Build the Wall. Now, the co-founders of that group have been indicted, accused of funneling some of their donations into their own pockets. I reached out to founder Brian Kolfage. He never responded. But another issue remains. This gate that the group built over federal property.
The gate was built on federal property without permission. What you're supposed to do is submit your permit application before you build and get it approved. That did not occur, but the structure is here. We have an arrangement where it's left open during the day. We open it and close it actually so that we can perform our duties. And it is really important for them to submit the required information so that we can review it as part of a complete permit application.
In terms of that wall, do you think that there was ever an implicit endorsement of that project from the department or from Spener?
I don't believe so. Again, we've been very clear that if individuals want to help, we're happy to talk to them. But you've got to do that in conjunction with the Border Patrol. So I went to that section of wall again to understand what my men and women had, how they were going to operate that section of wall. It is different than other parts of the wall that CBP owns and operates with the U.S. Corps of Engineers. And so I wanted to understand, again, they have some difficulties with that section of the wall. And so we talked about that, and I got a sense of where that's going. So again, we're happy that outside groups, third-party groups want to contribute to border security, and we're willing to talk with everyone. But again, you got to do that in conjunction with the Border Patrol.
That does it for this week's episode of Built in the Borderland. I hope you enjoyed those conversations. I hope that you were able to gain some insight. That's the whole point of this program. Remember, you can always reach out to me with ideas about the people and places you think I should explore for future episodes. Until then, I'm Robert Holguin.